Good morning, and welcome again to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll continue now where we left off in the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. The people of Italy, almost entirely Roman Catholic, have decided that the Pope should not rule over them anymore, and that the Pope, if he wishes to remain the head of the church, may do so, but that the people of Italy are going to create their own government and deal in their own governmental affairs, making the laws to suit themselves and literally to throw off the tyrannical chains of the papacy's temporal power. They're sick and tired of being governed by the Pope. They wish to have their own laws in place. And despite all opposition, these Italian people did do so. They threw off the temporal power of the Pope, no longer acknowledging the Pope as a temporal king. They established their own government, began to pass their own laws. This incensed the papacy, stripping from him his silver key, his temporal power, which all of canon law establishes. And the papacy fulminated against these rebellious Italians and said that they were trying to destroy the church because they destroyed the power of the head of the church, the Pope. Now, in response to the Italian people establishing their own government and literally putting the papacy out to pasture, the Pope put on his full papal vestments, his crown, and fulminated an allocution against the new Italian government. Beginning halfway down the page on page 316, if you're following along, it says, "Putting on, therefore, his full papal armor, in imitation of some of his predecessors, he endeavored to upturn and to destroy the new government of Italy by the thunder of his anathemas." Can't you just see this Pope putting on his ridiculous garb and standing before the world as though he were the voice of God Almighty and hurling thunderous anathemas at this government, supposedly that the very sound of his voice would cause this new government to crumble on its foundations? You talk about arrogance. This is the papacy. Pope Pius IX accordingly abrogated and declared null and void and without force and effect all its laws and decrees in conflict with his claim of supreme and absolute authority over both spiritual and temporal affairs throughout the whole of Italy, including the provinces which had annexed themselves to Sardinia. It requires a very inventive imagination to conceive of an act of more supreme folly than this useless allocution, says R.W. Thompson. But no matter how useless the world believes that this allocution was, it becomes the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church. When the Pope speaks, he speaks for the whole church, and to be truly Roman Catholic, you must assent both your mind and your will to this allocution. Now, Pope Pius IX set the course for the Roman Catholic Church, particularly for the Vatican, with this allocution. He not only condemned the republican form or the constitutional form of government of Italy, he was likewise condemning all of the constitutional governments throughout the world, demanding that he and only he had the divine right to rule as a king over the nations of the world. We see this example with Italy, but it is a case in point to drive home the reality that the papacy claims to be the divine right king of kings all over the world. Now, if Pope Pius IX had been less perturbed and calm enough to reason logically, he might have observed how fatal to his own conclusion was an important confession made by him in his official allocution. Without seeming to comprehend its full meaning and force, he declared it to be, quote, a singular arrangement of divine providence, unquote, that the Pope, quote, was invested with his civil authority, unquote, at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, that is, during the latter half of the 5th century and nearly 500 years after the beginning of the Christian era. Okay, the Pope claims that the temporal power was added to the papacy by the fall of the old Roman Empire. Remember, he who now restrains will restrain till he's taken out of the way, and then that man of sin shall be revealed. This is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy in history, where at the fall of the old pagan Roman Empire, the papacy picked up the scepter of Rome and became not only the prince of the church, the priest of the church, but the king or the emperor of the entire Roman Empire. This is where he gets his so-called divine right to rule over temporal affairs. King of Kings. This is where he gets his King of Kings status, and it came late in the 5th century. Now, if he had been sensible, he'd have realized that this temporal power did not belong to anyone before him, that the primitive Christian church had no king but Christ. They had no need for a pope, and that this is a complete usurpation of Christ's rightful throne, this claim to temporal power, and likewise his claim to spiritual power. Now, R.W. Thompson continues, in this he admits, that is, that the papacy did not receive the temporal power until late in the 5th century. It says, in this, Pope Pius admits, certainly by necessary implication, that during all the long period preceding that event, the affairs of the church have been conducted without the assistance of a temporal monarch at Rome or elsewhere, and by spiritual authority alone, by bishops who look after religious and not political affairs. He must have been guilty of a singular omission of duty if it did not occur to him to inquire why so great and radical a change in the management of the church affairs had not been made before the fall of the Roman Empire, but had been deferred until that particular period, late in the 5th century. It's easy enough to understand how the popes may have become kings in a purely temporal sense after that event, but that was not the question he was considering. His object was to show that when the Roman Empire fell, the temporal power was divinely added to the spiritual power of the Pope, and therefore that it would be a violation, it would violate the divine law if he were deprived of the crown of temporal royalty, which the popes of the primitive times did not possess. Now here, R.W. Thompson makes the same mistake that most Christians make today, that the Roman Catholic Church is a Christian church, that the Vatican is a Christian institution, that the papacy is a Christian institution, and followed on after the apostolic times. No, the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, represents that falling away, okay? It's never to be regarded as Christianity. It's to be regarded as counter-Christianity. All right? But R.W. Thompson, in his efforts, obviously, not to offend his Catholic readers, likens the papacy as to something that followed on after the primitive church, a continuation of the Christian faith, only just, let's say, compromised by the rise of this so-called temporal power of the Pope. No, this represents Antichrist. The Protestant reformers were right, the Waldenses were right, the Albigensians were right, the Hussites were right, and all the martyrs of Jesus were right. This is Antichrist. The throne of Antichrist rose with the throne of Peter at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, a little calm reflection, says R.W. Thompson, might have enabled Pope Pius IX to see, in the light of his own statement, what fallacy there is in the pretense that belief in the divine establishment of the temporal power is a necessary and essential part of true religious faith. For if it had been the divine purpose that Christianity should not exist without it, that purpose would have been fulfilled long before the fall of the Roman Empire. The concession of Pope Pius IX must consequently be taken as fatal to the claim of temporal power as necessarily pertaining to the cause of Christianity or to the Church as a religious body. The primitive Christians had no knowledge of it, and the fact that they had not, which he concedes, suggests such a contrast between the early Church was immediately following the apostolic period and what it became after the papacy was established by means alone of the temporal power, as to show conclusively that the papal pretense of sovereignty must have been the result of usurpation. And it is. An unlawful, satanic usurpation of Christ's rightful throne. This is not just an error in the Christian faith. No, this is the rise of Antichrist. This is counter-Christianity. Now, the condition of the European nations at the period here referred to, although certainly not designed for that purpose by the chief actors, was favorable to the cause of Italian independence. The jealousies and rivalries among the sovereigns had brought them into such relations as to require immense standing armies to keep watch over each other. Austria was not only one of the most restless, but the most arbitrary of the great powers, and soon found it necessary of her own accord to withdraw her armies from Italy in order to protect herself against attack at exposed points within her own borders. The removal of this formidable adversary greatly encouraged the whole populations of the Italian peninsula, among whom the desire to become united with the Kingdom of Italy became almost universal. So here we have this vast, overpowering Austrian army that attempted to uphold the temporal power of the Pope and put down this rebellious demand for a constitutional form of government, finally of its own, withdrew from Italy because of circumstances demanding that it did in order to protect itself from enemies from within. Now, I believe this is divine providence. Now, it says, after Venetia, by a vote practically unanimous, decided to do so, the revolutionary spirit was greatly aroused. There were, however, among the revolutionists some who were so enthusiastic as to demand a republic, which for a time somewhat threatened the cause of independence. In other words, the Italian people wanted independence from the Pope, but they also wanted a king. Okay? They thought it would be going too far to put all the power in the people. Anyway, it says, all of these favored the new government under Victor Emmanuel to a longer continuance of papal rule, but desired to dispense with a king entirely, preferring that the entire pontifical sovereignty should be vested in the people. Okay, that's a republic, where the entire power of politics resides in the people alone. No king. And it says these readily rallied at the call of Garibaldi and made preparations for attacking Rome. In the meantime, after the withdrawal of the Austrians, Louis Napoleon, acting under a species of infatuation which he never could well explain and nobody could fully understand, he sent a large body of French troops to Italy to protect the temporal power of Pope Pius IX and hold him upon the throne, it having been fully demonstrated by this time that nothing but foreign military force could do so. The Garibaldians were defeated by the French, which event, although it produced a temporary sadness among the patriotic Italians, did not intimidate them. The course of events among the sovereigns favored their cause to such a degree that there are far better grounds for saying that they were providentially designed to abolish the temporal power than there are in support of the pretense that it was divinely established at the fall of the Roman Empire or at any other time. Louis Napoleon had his own affairs to look after. His stealth of the imperial crown of France had given fresh spur to his ambition, but his perfidy was so flagrant that even among the staunchest monarchists he was held in contempt. His self-conceit made war between Prussia and France inevitable, and when that event was brought on, he realized, probably for the first time, that he had been engaged in the ignominious work of preventing the independence of Italy and forcing the Italian people to accept a king they had almost unanimously decided to reject. Whether he fully realized this or not, his necessities compelled him to withdraw the French troops from Italy and to leave Pope Pius IX without the support of foreign troops who had stood guard over his temporal crown during every hour of his pontificate. The war between Prussia and France was a terrible blow at Pope Pius IX, but an event of incalculable value to the cause of the Italian independence. And when it led to Sedan, the capture of Paris, and the loss of Alsace and Lorraine by France, Victor Emmanuel steadily kept his eyes upon the unification of Italy, which even Pope Pius IX understood to mean the abolition of his temporal power. Victor Emmanuel again had an opportunity of acting frankly towards the Pope and fairly with the Church. He endeavored to explain himself in a letter to Pope Pius IX, wherein, quote, with the faith of a Catholic, but with the dignity of a king, unquote, he declared that it was not his purpose to impair or to interfere with the spiritual authority or independence of the Pope, and that he would maintain these with his troops, and counseling him to recognize the stubborn facts which confronted him and which he was powerless to change, he urged him to accept this as the only practical and possible solution of the difficulties surrounding him. He closed his appeal with these words, quote, Your Holiness, in delivering Rome from the foreign troops, in freeing it from the continual peril of being the battlefield of subversive parties, will have accomplished a marvelous work, given peace to the Church, and shown to Europe, shocked by the horrors of war, how great battles can be won and immortal victories achieved by the acts of justice and by a single word of affection, unquote. Here, in an eloquent and touching appeal, the king implored the Pope to, quote, give peace to the Church, unquote, well knowing as he did that the only purpose of the revolution was to get rid of the temporal power of the Pope and establish a constitutional government, and that if this question were disposed of by the acquiescence of Pope Pius IX, the vast multitude of Roman Catholics then in arms would return to their homes and be content to live in peace and quiet under his spiritual dominion. Just give up your temporal power, Pope, and this is all over. Everybody goes home. Everybody goes back to work. Everybody beats their weapons, their swords into plowshares, and Italy lives in peace. Just surrender your temporal power. We don't need it. The early church didn't have it. It's a usurpation. You can live without it. We'll uphold your spiritual power even with our own military troops. Just give up your temporal power. But Pope Pius IX wouldn't hear it. He said the issue was a single and a simple one, which could not be misunderstood, and that it should be made so clear that even the most common mind could comprehend it fully. Victor Emmanuel accompanied his letter with a statement of the terms which he proposed for adjusting the relations between the Church and the state. They were these: all nations should have free access to the Pope, all churches in Rome to be neutralized, ambassadors to the Pope to enjoy full immunity, the cardinals to retain their revenues and immunity, the salaries of all military and civil functionaries to be paid as before, and the bishops and the clergy throughout Italy to have, quote, the full and absolutely free exercise of their ecclesiastical functions, unquote. Pretty fair terms, isn't it? Don't you think? In the act of separating the powers of church from the powers of state, Victor Emmanuel maintained all of the spiritual power of the church and the Pope. Conceded that he was the head of the Roman Catholic Church, that his priests must answer to him, and allowed them to keep on as they did before, only without the temporal power. Even maintained their immunity, which I would never permit. I would hold the papacy and the priests to the civil laws of the state. And because the papacy, regarded as a divine institution, and the priests as divine accessories of the Pope, alter Christos, as they're called, another Christ, they're held immune from the civil power. That's why the pedophile priest pandemic runs unchecked in the world. And the priest can conduct clandestine wars, murders, assassinations, and they are untouchable according to the civil law. They're held immune from civil authorities. This was a grave error on the part of Victor Emmanuel. It's a grave error on the part of the government of the United States as well. And not even to mention that the Pope is the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, and that the Roman Catholic Church represents itself as the woman that rides the bloody beast of Revelation chapter 17. This is the knowledge that brought forth the Protestant Reformation. All these things we're talking about are just halfway measures taking place in Italy, France, Portugal, and Spain, and all the other Roman Catholic nations. They're all happy to regard the papacy as the voice of Christ in this world. And so goes the whole world, even the United States of America. Now, R.W. Thompson continues at the top of page 321. He says, it would be hard, if not impossible, for a liberal mind to fault with these propositions. They were so generally accepted as fair that any comment upon them is unnecessary. They encountered no objection except from those who preferred that the Pope should remain an absolute temporal monarch with full power to make and unmake all the laws to a constitutional government representing the people. They were made by a Roman Catholic king, representing and speaking for several millions of Roman Catholic people, and besides being a conciliatory and kindly spirit, bore upon their face conclusive evidence of sincerity. When we come up on the break, we'll return to the Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson when we return from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find, but investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get Left Behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to keep Inquisition Update on the air, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you wish to contact me, please do so by email at tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. Now, the new king of Italy, Victor Emmanuel, has made an offer to Pope Pius IX that he couldn't refuse, but he did refuse it. It says it would be hard, if not impossible, for a liberal mind to find fault with these propositions. They were so generally accepted as fair that any comment upon them is unnecessary. They encountered no objection except from those who preferred that the Pope should remain an absolute temporal monarch with full power to make and unmake all the laws, to a constitutional government representing the people. They were made by a Roman Catholic king, Victor Emmanuel, representing and speaking for several millions of Roman Catholic people, and besides being a conciliatory and kindly spirit, bore upon their face conclusive evidence of sincerity. If they had been accepted by the Pope, the true faith of the Church, says R.W. Thompson erroneously here, the true faith of the Church would have been untouched, and the Pope in full possession of all his rightful and necessary spiritual powers. The Church, in fact, would have been brought back to its primitive condition before the fall of the Roman Empire. But Pope Pius IX, instead of reciprocating the generosity of the king, mourned over with deep sorrow, mourned over the deep sorrow which filled his life with bitterness, and at the same time treated the propositions of the king with intense scorn. He was then the first pope in all the long history of the Roman Catholic Church who had been allowed authoritatively to avow his own personal infallibility. This Pope, Pope Pius IX, was the first Pope to officially be declared infallible by the First Vatican Council held in 1870 against the protests of even the priests. And it says, he was then the first pope in all the long history of the Roman Catholic Church who had been allowed authoritatively to avow his own personal infallibility. He had convened the celebrated Council of the Vatican, the First Vatican Council in 1870, in which but few weeks before the Jesuits had succeeded in having him declared infallible by the passage of a decree dictated by himself and secured by the suppression of debate against the protest of a number of bishops, including several from the United States. Having obtained this victory over the liberalism of the Church, and thus thrown himself completely into the arms of the Jesuits, and preferring an alliance with them to a union with millions of Roman Catholics who favored a constitutional government, he made it virtually impossible to take a single step toward conciliation or to carry on even an amicable discussion with the king. He manifestly felt as if no human power had the right to demand or to expect conciliation or discussion from an infallible pope. The council had affirmed his universal sovereignty and had encouraged him in the belief that he possessed the power of omnipotence, so that those who refused obedience to him were under the curse of God. The time for debate, therefore, had passed with him, and no longer were thoughts of peace and conciliation to be entertained. Consequently, he is represented by a friendly pen as having, with an air of imperial majesty, broken off the official interview with the envoy of Victor Emmanuel by expressing, quote, the full measure of his scorn and indignation, unquote, in these expressive words, quote, in the name of Jesus Christ, I tell you that you are all whited sepulchres, unquote. You remember, this is the Pope that was hopefully to give concessions to the people, that gave amnesty to all political prisoners, in the vain hope that this Pope would surrender at least part of his temporal power and allow the people to form their own government. This Pope now calls them all whited sepulchres. That's why they call him Antichrist. He's a deceiver, a liar. He's led by the father of lies, Satan himself, not Jesus Christ. He is no representation of Jesus Christ whatsoever. Now, there was nothing then left for Victor Emmanuel but to advance his troops and take possession of the city of Rome in the name of the new kingdom of Italy. He delayed no longer. After crossing the frontier of the papal territory, his army engaged in several skirmishes with the Zouaves of the Pope, but met with no serious resistance. Remember, the Zouaves were a military order created to protect the papacy. But they were no match for Victor Emmanuel. And it says on the 20th of September, 1870, orders were given to attack the city. 2 breaches were soon opened in the walls, and as the victorious Italians entered, the papal troops retreated, and Pope Pius IX took refuge in the castle of St. Angelo as a fugitive from the city, where but for a short time before, a decree of his personal infallibility had been forced through a stacked council by such methods as no other body of men in the world would have submitted to, and to which it is not likely they would have submitted but for the influence of the Jesuits. Okay, R.W. Thompson rightly credits the Jesuits for having incited Pope Pius IX to demand his personal infallibility. This is where we get papal infallibility. It was a a brainchild of the Jesuits. And I maintain that it was floated in 1870 so that after a period of decades and centuries, it would no longer be challenged. Papal infallibility would no longer be challenged, and then would be the appropriate time for what we see in the world today, the first Jesuit to occupy the throne of Peter, so-called. Now, the Pope, having fled and made himself a voluntary prisoner in the castle of St. Angelo, the remaining duties pertaining to the papal government devolved upon Cardinal Antonelli, who still called himself the Secretary of State. This consisted of a formal and puerile protest in the name of the fugitive Pope, wherein he declared that nothing done by the Kingdom of Italy had conveyed any rights whatsoever against the dominion and possession of the Pope, and that the Pope, quote, both knows his rights and intends to conserve them intact and re-enter at the proper time into their actual possession, unquote. In other words, the papacy is literally telling Victor Emmanuel that I will regain all of my power. You are a government in fact, but I am the government de jure. And when such time arrives that I can regain my spiritual and temporal authority over not only Italy but the whole world, I will do so. And I'm insisting to my listeners that those days have arrived, that the papacy now claims its spiritual and temporal sword all over the world. Now, it says all that can be said of this is that whilst practically it was mere unmeaning bravado, it fully set forth the policy and the purposes of Pope Pius IX, by which he expected, with the aid of the 200 million Roman Catholics around the world, to destroy the new Italian government and bring the people again under papal dominion. Strange fatuity, made the more strange by the fact that these announcements proceeded from the first pope whose personal infallibility had been approved by a conciliar decree. The possession of Rome and the flight of the people made it necessary to put in operation the machinery of the new government. Accordingly, a temporal government was formed and provision made for taking the vote of the whole population to decide whether or not the people were for or against the unification of Italy. At this vote, an overwhelming majority decided in favor of the new government, thus indicating that even if the people had hitherto been persuaded to believe that the kingship of the Pope had been of divine creation, they had become enlightened enough to understand that Providence, capital P, had permitted it to continue long enough, and that as it had succeeded in separating the Western and the Eastern Christians and splitting the whole into a rival and warring faction, the time had been reached when, by a new dispensation, the spiritual department of the Church should be purified by stripping the Pope of his imperial authority and enlarging the sphere of his spiritual functions and duties. Okay, here is a mention that it was because of the temporal power of the Pope and his demand to be a king of kings resulted in the split of the Roman Catholic Church that took place in 1054, where the Eastern Church separated itself from the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, he says here, backing up a little bit, at this vote, an overwhelming majority decided in favor of the new government, thus indicating that even if the people had hitherto been persuaded to believe that the kingship of the Pope had been of divine creation, they had become enlightened enough to understand that Providence had permitted it to continue long enough, and that as it had succeeded in separating the Western from the Eastern Christians and splitting the whole into rival warring factions, the time had been reached when, by a new dispensation, the spiritual department of the church would be purified by stripping the Pope of his imperial authority and enlarging the sphere of his spiritual functions and duties. So, for the first time, it's being acknowledged that the blame for the split in the Roman Catholic Church was due because of the claim of the temporal power of the popes. Now it says, realizing that God governs the world in all things by his providences, and casting their eyes over the nations to see where the largest degree of prosperity and happiness prevailed, they were awakened to the conviction that as these had been produced where church and state were separated, the divine wisdom had been displayed by pointing out to them the like measure of relief for their existing grievances. Taught by their own instincts to believe that the shifting dispensations of God's providences were only so many methods of exhibiting his sovereign power, and that as he had permitted their forefathers and themselves to bear the burden of papal temporal power for centuries, it was natural for them to conclude that he had at least indicated to them the duty of exchanging it for that liberty and intellectual development which free constitutional governments had assured to other peoples as the means of making them happier and more prosperous, better able to appreciate and discharge the duties which pertain to citizenship as well as to Christian life. So they began to comprehend that it was God who was liberating the people from the temporal power of the Pope. Okay? I wish they'd have gone all the way, but nonetheless, give the Italian people credit. They wanted to govern themselves. They could govern themselves more righteously than could the papacy, and for good reason. Now it says, God had tolerated their misfortunes only in the sense in which he has permitted slavery to exist. But they could not be persuaded to believe that he intended longer to perpetuate them by his providences, any more than can a people of this country consent that the former existence of slavery here overthrew the fundamental truth set forth in our Declaration of Independence, that the inalienable right to freedom and civil equality is derived from the natural law. A very large majority of the aggregate vote cast in the provinces having been in favor of the new government, the negative vote being less than 2,000 in number, it became necessary to adjust the future relations between the church and the state so that they could exist harmoniously together, each in full possession of its proper functions. Accordingly, the Pope and all the papal authorities were notified that the utmost liberality would be displayed toward the Church, and that there would be no interference with it whatsoever except the abolition of the Pope's temporal power, and such provisions in regard to temporal affairs as that rendered necessary. It's only necessary to observe the leading provisions made by the new government to show their liberality and to demonstrate the folly of their rejection, and to realize how much the Church has lost by the unwise and infatuated policy of Pope Pius IX. It is sufficient to observe that there is no government existing in the world today from which the same conciliatory terms could be obtained. Not all of them could have been obtained, even then, from any other but a Roman Catholic population. Okay? Never forget that this is a Roman Catholic country that has thrown off the temporal yoke of the papacy. It was France, a Roman Catholic country, who did likewise. Spain, the most Catholic country in the world, did likewise. Portugal, easily the second most Roman Catholic country in the world, did likewise. And right there in the shadow of the Vatican, the Italian people, the Roman Catholic Italian people, gained the concession of the temporal power of the Pope. Not willingly, and the Pope has made promise to the world that it will regain in time its full power, both spiritual and temporal. That is the New World Order. The New World Order is simply a return to the Old World Order that is being thrown off at the time of the writing of this book. Now, the policy of the new government was set forth as follows. The Pope was to be left entirely free to exercise all of his spiritual rights as before. He was to continue to possess, quote, the prerogatives of a sovereign prince, unquote, and his court was to be provided for with that in view. He was to be secured, quote, a territorial immunity, unquote, limited, of course, within bounds to be defined, wherein he should be free and independent of the state. All the prelates, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and those in ecclesiastical orders who should be summoned to Rome by the Pope were to enjoy immunity from civil interference. The Pope was to be permitted to communicate with foreign powers and the Church throughout the world, and to make special postal and telegraphic services at his command. All the representatives of foreign powers at the court of the Pope were to enjoy perfect liberty. Freedom of publication and communication were assured. The Pope was guaranteed, quote, full liberty to travel at all times and at all seasons in and out of the country, unquote, and was to be treated and honored as, quote, a foreign lay sovereign, unquote, throughout Italy. His royal empennage and the members of his court were to be furnished by the new government, which should also pay the debts of the pontifical states, and the liberties of the Church and the spiritual independence of the Pope were to be fully and amply guaranteed. These fair and liberal provisions had reference only to the changed relations produced by the abolition of the temporal power. They involved a purely political question, except as it had been made religio-political by the doctrine of the Jesuits, which Pope Pius IX had adopted, to the effect that it was a necessary part of the faith of the Church that the Pope should be a temporal monarch. The Roman Catholic population of Italy, having rejected this doctrine and demanded that the expulsion of the Jesuits, because they taught it, these provisions were the result of their desire to leave Pope Pius IX in the full possession and enjoyment of all his spiritual powers. It was intended by them to provide merely for the new condition of affairs, and to recognize the Kingdom of Italy as an accomplished fact, neither to be controverted nor changed. Victor Emmanuel, as a firm and consistent Roman Catholic, was not disposed to do anything less, and his obligations to the Italian people would not allow him to do more. But Pope Pius IX, still continuing to sorrow over the destruction of the quote-unquote old regime, and I will call it what we would refer to it today as the old world order, and clinging to the Jesuit idea that God was offended because he had lost his temporal crown, refused to be reconciled. Bemoaning the incompetency of the people to decide what was right and what was wrong in affairs of government, and the inevitable ruin which he imagined would follow their attempt to be governed without a Pope King, he again hurled his fiercest anathemas at the new government and at the heads of all who had aided in its creation. And having done this, the controversy was brought to an end, leaving it well understood that Church and State had been finally separated in Italy by a Roman Catholic population, and that Pope Pius IX would not be reconciled to the loss of his temporal sovereignty which that separation occasioned, or to anything short of his restoration to absolute royal power. There were other acts necessary to complete the entire drama, but these would draw off into fields crowded with multitude of combatants. We're now concerned only with the conflict about the temporal power, and the bearing of that power upon the right of the Italian people to have a voice in the construction of the government and the passage of such laws as their own welfare required. That was the only issue between the Italians and the papacy, between Victor Emmanuel and Pope Pius IX. If the latter, Pope Pius IX, had adhered to the convictions of his own mind when he first introduced measures of reform, and had followed the kindly dictates of his own heart, many heart-burnings and bickerings might have been avoided, and the Church might have escaped a serious and staggering blow. The contestants upon both sides were attached to the Church, its history, its traditions, and its faith. In other words, this is an entire Roman Catholic society. There's no Protestantism factoring in here in all these controversies. It says a calm discussion between them as to what it had or had not taught with regard to the temporal power would have made it clear that it did not involve any essential article of the Christian creed, and they might thus have been led to see that as this power did not exist in the apostolic and primitive times, there could not rightfully exist in the changed condition of the world anything to render it absolutely necessary to the existence and growth of Christianity in the present age. But when Pope Pius IX suffered his mind to be impressed by the teachings and the doctrines of the Jesuits, and allowed them to mold his pontifical policy, passionate declamation took the place of calm decision, a discussion, and made reconciliation impossible. So the Jesuits were the ones who created this impossible division between the papacy and the Italian people. And it was strictly over the Pope's temporal power. The Jesuits want the world to be governed by the volition of a single man, whoever occupies the papal chair. And it is the Jesuits who fomented this so-called papal infallibility and gave the Pope a godlike status in the world, and also insist that the world acknowledge the Pope's temporal power. Now, when those most devoted to the Church look back upon this conflict and realize upon what a multitude of their Christian brethren and papal anathemas are still resting, because of their refusal to assent to a dogma of faith which strikes at the foundation of free constitutional government, they cannot fail to observe that whilst the blow has fallen heavily upon the Church, the Jesuits alone have achieved a triumph. Only the Jesuits were gainers in all of this. And we'll talk about that tomorrow on the broadcast. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. We'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.